Hello everyone, and thank you for stopping by, and I hope that you are all doing well in your corner of the world. The purpose of this video is to serve as an introduction to my portfolio where I'll be going over the projects you see here while also sharing my level design thought process. You can find the sections of each project I go over in this video in their respective entries on the website, so if you wish to skip this video to visit those pages, you can do so without worry of missing any important information here. With that said, thanks again for your time, and let's begin. Kevuru Games is an independent studio located in Kyiv, Ukraine that I had the honor of working with for about 8 months. During my time there, I was involved in the development of 2 projects. The first was Steam Dwarfs, which is a kind of sim strategy game where I was tasked with designing the introductory area of the game. And the second was Mecha Chain, a multiplayer mecha shooter where I was responsible for assembling the first map for the alpha stage of the project. Since both titles are, at the time of this video, still in active development, I was instructed that I cannot share any images and unfortunately have to be vague. Suffice it to say, though, that between the 2 projects I was responsible for all stages of the level design, including concepts, grayboxing, playtesting, lighting, optimization, and of course documentation. While I cannot share any images here, I can at the very least provide links to public articles that show a sliver of the work I did. The information here will be updated as soon as I'm allowed to do so. Andromeda was my first title working within the game industry. It was an ambitious project made in Unreal Engine 5 and was inspired by game environments from Call of Duty and Escape from Tarkov's realism style of gameplay. I was involved with the project for over a month before it was unfortunately shut down. The original plan for the game was that every map had a unique mechanic that could happen randomly or be triggered by player interactions. In this case, the gimmick was simply darkness, which I'll go into more detail about later. The map that I worked on was influenced by Call of Duty's Kill House, which is in essence a training ground for the armed forces. I began by researching and collecting references from both Call of Duty's Kill House map and Escape from Tarkov, as well as real-world shoot houses. During my research, I found it interesting that the interior layout of shoot houses would differ wildly, and some were a simple sequence of bare rooms while others would attempt to emulate lived-in homes complete with prop furniture. So in my layout, I decided that all the buildings outside of the large central complex would be bare, just walls and perhaps a stairway in certain structures. Meanwhile, within the central complex, the layout would be a faux office/production warehouse, complete with props. I felt this idea would encourage faster movement through the exterior, more open portions of the map. Next, I would draw up some basic layouts with proposed primary locations and bonus objectives like I've highlighted here. If done correctly, this would make the complex a naturally dangerous space to navigate. I felt this also made it an obvious space to place primary objective targets that players would compete over. The interior layout of the central complex went through a few drawing iterations before in-engine work would begin. After getting the scale nailed down, I began blocking out the scene using simple geometry brushes. Many of those cubes were then hollowed out to emulate simple buildings. Since there were going to be quite a few of these container-like structures, I saved some time by making a few versions and saving them as static meshes for a bit of modularity. Then, some simple BSP props were made as stand-ins as the interior was being fleshed out. Shoot houses in the real world are designed to train close-quarters combat skills of the armed forces. While I was fairly confident in facilitating this dynamic within the structures of the complex, the exterior was a challenge. I wanted to prevent any player on the ground floor from being able to see from one end of the map to the other side. So I placed various objects and mini structures to break up long lines of sight. Getting the layout to feel right without turning it into a convoluted mess took some time and several iterations. In the end, though, I believe we have something solid that we could play test on multiplayer. Once we felt we had a good enough blockout, I dedicated time to try and develop the dynamic lighting that would be critical for the map's primary mechanic, darkness. My plan was to place a few dozen windows that lined the walls and ceiling and have them covered with a panel once the condition was met. In this case, when the player cuts off the power and the building goes into lockdown mode. I purposefully built the level with a single directional light up to this point, just so I could more easily get this effect. However, mainly due to my inexperience, I had trouble implementing this idea. The most I could achieve was low light conditions instead of complete darkness. To my chagrin, I was able to easily get this done using Unreal's Lumen system. Lumen was, and still is, fairly costly in performance and was not an option for our target platforms, so I had to keep plugging away at the regular dynamic lighting. Unfortunately, it was around this time that we received news that production of Andromeda was going to cease for the foreseeable future due to funding issues. I was given permission to do whatever I liked for my portfolio, so I decided to duplicate the map and perform a detailed pass. My reasons were twofold. First, I wanted to see what the map could have looked like with quote-unquote final art assets. And second, I had hoped the director of the studio could possibly make some promotional materials and perhaps attract other investors so the project could survive. The results of that effort can be seen here. Overall, my experience with Andromeda was positive and educational. It will always hold a special place in my heart for the simple fact that it was my first foot into the door of the industry, which is something I'll always be grateful for. The project was also interesting since it was my first foray into multiplayer level design, which, despite my inexperience, still helped me land my second industry job. One of my greatest regrets was not being able to test the map fully over the network with my team members. While I would of course heavily playtest the map myself with every iteration, I felt not being able to test the multiplayer capabilities of the space was a significant flaw. Another regret I had was not having the time to finish implementing the low light sequence of the map. It was a cool idea that I think would have greatly altered the dynamics and the feel of the playable arena. BioCarnage was my capstone for UCF, and it is a third-person shooter that is built in the Unreal Engine. I was also the team's only level designer, so I designed, concept, and gray box every area within the game. And when I was brought onto the team, I was tasked with first creating a prototype, which you see right here. And I designed this with some popular games of mine like Halo and Unreal Tournament. And I designed this level for the prototype to be an arena similar to those two games I just mentioned. So I designed it to be very close quarters, some verticality to give the player some range of movement, get used to the controls, and get used to some combat. And you can see here, this was the final result of the prototype that allowed us to continue to make the full game. After that happened, I went on to design the desert level in its entirety. Now, I knew from the get-go that it was going to be a linear experience, but I also wanted to give the player a sense of freedom so that way they know they're not just on one strict path. They had some room to maneuver and explore and hopefully have some fun. So the goal of the desert level was essentially to introduce the player mechanics and combat, as well as hopefully give the player a sense of freedom and being powerful, like they can just mow through all the enemies that you find here. But again, I wanted to ensure that the player had the option to choose their own path. So the way that I went about this, I tried to create 3 different primary paths. The one on the left was basically for our players who are already familiar with how to move about in the game, whereas the middle one was for our players who liked the combat and just wanted to get into the thick of it. And then finally, the one on the right, the light combat path, was basically our scenic route. This is where you would still have to fight some enemies, but they're fairly small and very easy to get through, and it gives you a nice view of the entire section. After we were done with the desert level, I then went into the metro, where the design for this one was very different from the desert. For one, it was obviously in an interior environment, and it by its nature was modular in design. For this particular level, I heavily relied on 2D maps. So I did a bunch of sketches, I laid them down, and I put them into Photoshop and presented it to my team for approval that you can see here. And once everybody was on board and I was ready to get into the engine, I started implementing my layouts directly into the engine, as you can see here, and then I started constructing the environment around it, like you can see in this first block out. And then afterwards, when the entire block out was made, I then started to focus on lighting, because I knew in this particular level I wanted to contrast with the desert level very starkly. Whereas in the desert level, I wanted you to feel open and free. In the subway, I wanted you to feel confined and maybe a little even creeped out by the environment. So I made everything really dark and as dingy and as broken as possible. And after the metro level, we get into ground zero. This is very different from the other two areas where this is more open, but it's also underground. And this also gave me the opportunity to explore the aliens' culture. So in Ground Zero, the goal was to defeat the final boss, but in order to get to it, you have to shut down the power to the surrounding bases. In this case, there were 4, and each base has a different theme. The first one was essentially the alien temple, where they worship the alien boss as kind of like their deity. The second area is basically the metamorph birthing chamber, which is the enemy that was introduced in the ending of the metro that you can see right here. And this happens to be one of my favorite locations because I took some design inspirations from the film 1984. So I wanted to try to emulate that by creating a large screen that the metamorph would stare into. I made the walls, for example, highly reflective, so that way the metamorph, which used to be humans, can see how they've been mutilated, and there's no option for them to go back to their humanity, so they just become servants of the aliens. And for the next area is basically the alien hangar. This one is fairly straightforward. I just wanted to show how the aliens are actually mobilized. They are organized, they are efficient, they are powerful, and they have a lot of firepower behind it. And then this last base here is essentially what I call the recycling center. And this is where essentially all of the aliens that have been defeated are sent to basically be broken down and become food for the elder boss.